Right. Well, it is 12 o'clock. So, in the interest of time, we'll see people trickling in, but I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I'm Virginia Ferris. I am work with outreach and teaching in Special Collections Research Center. Just to kind of contextualize who we are, Special Collections Research Center is part of NC State University Libraries. We collect, describe, preserve, and provide access to archives and special collections in support of teaching, learning, and research at NC State University and beyond. So I'm going to let my two colleagues, Gwen and Shima, introduce themselves briefly.
Thank you, Virginia. My name is Gwen Thayer, and I'm the chief curator here in Special Collections. And one of my jobs is to build our collections in this collecting area of animal rights, animal welfare, animal protection. Shima?
Hi everyone, my name is Shima Hosseini Nasab. I'm an instruction and outreach librarian for special collections. I teach using primary sources. I will hand it back to Gwen or Virginia.
I'll take it for now, just to give a couple notes on some housekeeping items. We are recording the meeting for to provide online access following the event today. And you can submit any questions in the Q&A section or the chat, and we will share the questions with our presenter, Zach, after the presentation to address in the final portion of our hour here. So given that, I will hand it back over to Gwen.
Great. Thank you. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining today. We have lots of folks who are joining, so we're very excited to have you all here today. First of all, I wanted to share some acknowledgments and thank yous. First of all, to Martin Rowe and Lisa Burnell of the Culture and Animals Foundation for their support of the Tom Regan Fellowship, and to Carol Glasser and the members of the American Sociological Association's Animals and Society section for joining us today. And there's lots of other folks here I've worked with that I'm really excited to see as well. I wanted to mention also that applications are now open for the 2026 Tom Regan Fellowship, which is due later this month. Virginia or Shima will put the link there in the chat. So now it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Zachary Ferguson. Zachary is the 2025 Tom Regan Visiting Research Fellow. He is a philosophy Ph.D. candidate at UNC Chapel Hill, specializing in animal ethics. Before moving to Chapel Hill, he earned a MA in philosophy from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and a BA from Vanderbilt University in Nashville. His dissertation is about animal ethics and moral character, and his work has been published in journals such as Analysis, Synthes, and Politics, Philosophy and Economics. When he is not doing philosophy, he enjoys making music. You can see the guitars behind him, reading fiction, and learning languages. So today's presentation is titled Moral Character and Meat Eating. And very briefly, I can tell you what he'll be talking about. He's let us know that it is not hard to show that industrial animal farming is morally wrong. However, it is surprisingly difficult to show that the wrongness of farming practices means that it is wrong for consumers to eat meat. This is something that early advocates overlooked, and some philosophers have recently argued that the same principles that support animal advocacy also give us moral reasons to sometimes eat meat. In this talk, I argue against these views and show that we do have compelling moral reasons not to eat meat. To do so, I focus on elements of moral character, including the ways that we perceive animal products and how we feel towards them. So thank you all for joining, and I'm going to turn it over to Zach.
Great. Thank you, Gwen. Let me share my presentation quickly. Can everyone see that all right?
Yes.
Great, thank you. All right, I'd like to start. Thank you so much to the Culture and Animals Foundation for funding the fellowship, and I'd like to thank the Special Collections Research Center at NC State for hosting me. Thanks to Gwen for being so welcoming and for guiding me through the process. I had a great time going through the archives. So, as Wynn was saying, I'm a moral philosopher, and I'm working in the same analytic tradition as Tom Regan. So, my work tries to make progress on the conversations that he and others helped start. So, today I'll be talking about some contemporary developments in consumer ethics, so morality of purchasing, eating, and using animal products. And I'm specifically interested in the ethics of eating meat that wasn't purchased and will otherwise go to waste. Here's the plan for the talk. First, I'm going to introduce you to a family of views called New Omnivorism. These are the people who argue that sometimes we should eat meat out of the same concern for the same principles of animal protection that inspire many people to be vegan or vegetarian. And I think these are genuine. These people are genuine. They're not being trolls. I think many of them follow a principle plant forward but not vegan or vegetarian diet in their lives. I think they are scholars that take this very seriously. I'm going to introduce a version of this kind of view that I think is most plausible. I'll give a little bit of historical context informing the debate and talk a little bit about the work of Tom Regan and some of my experience learning about his views um, going through the Tom Regan papers. And then I'll talk about the existing responses to new omnivorism that I don't think work, that are not going to give the verdict that we shouldn't eat meat. And then I'll give my own positive proposal. So I'll explain why I think we shouldn't eat meat. And to do so, I'll talk a little bit about moral character. I'll tell you what moral character is, how I'm thinking about it. And then I'll talk about how it relates to species prejudice and what it would take to change our character. So I'm going to start with an example to motivate the kinds of questions I'm interested in. So I'm committed to animal protection. And imagine that I have a friend that visits me from out of town, a meat-eating friend, and they fly in, we spend the weekend together, and then they leave a chicken sandwich behind in my fridge that they didn't, some leftovers that they didn't get to, and then they leave, they fly out of town, and now it's just sitting in my fridge. So, I could throw it away, but the question is, is it okay to do that? Would it be wasteful? So, or should I eat it? Is there any reason why I shouldn't eat it? If I did, I wouldn't be financially supporting the animal industries at all, right? I wouldn't be paying for animal agriculture products, right? The chicken has already died. There's no way I can bring it back. These are the kinds of cases I'm interested in that I take to be the most prominent and perhaps most plausible versions of new omnivorism. Cases of preventing otherwise edible things from going to waste. I'll call this version of new omnivorism freeganism. Other people use that term in other ways. That's just how I'm going to use it here. And so, freeganism, I'll call the practice of generally abstaining from animal products. So, roughly like vegan, but make exceptions for products that would otherwise go unused. So, here are some examples of what might be freegan practices. So, leftovers at catered events, surplus food at restaurants, abandoned leftovers like the chicken sandwich I used as the example of friends, family, roommates. And then if we want to get a little spicier, maybe we could think of edible, otherwise edible, unopened goods that are salvaged from grocery store dumpsters. So a lot of food get thrown away from and grocery stores. Some people salvage them, or even ideas like roadkill and an animal struck by a vehicle. I'm not talking about like squirrels, but some people talk about things like deer or moose or bears. So salvaging meat from those kinds of animals. And the question is there anything morally wrong with eating these kinds of meat? So the Freegans say, first of all, no, there's no good moral reason not to, and two, there are good moral reasons to eat them. So why should you why should you eat these kinds of meat? Well, um, if I eat meat that I didn't buy and was otherwise going to be wasted, that can replace a plant-based meal that I would otherwise have to buy, right? So if I don't eat the chicken sandwich, I'll have to eat some plant foods, right? And the thing is, plant foods do sometimes involve harms to animals, not nearly as much as animal farming does, but there are harms nonetheless in industrial agriculture of any kind to animals, but also to workers and the environment. So, one example is that harvesting crops uses combine harvesters that will kill small field rodents. Another example would be using pesticides will eventually result in runoff that kills fish. So agricultural practices involve harms to animals, even if you're farming plants. So of course, if you're going to be vegan, you got to be careful, right? You don't want to be publicly supporting meat in a way that's going to make other people continue to eat factory farmed meat. You don't want to develop bad habits that will make you eventually want to go buy factory farmed meat, things like that. But like the case of the chicken sandwich left in the fridge, there are plenty of cases where it looks like you could do this in ways that look safely. So there are some good reasons they say for why sometimes you want to eat meat. And then they also say, well, it's not wrong to do so. And that's because let's look at the kind of standard arguments for vegetarianism or veganism for abstaining from animal products. Here's a kind of classic argument. Premise one says it's wrong to cause suffering unless there's a good reason to do so. That's meant to be fairly obvious. I hope we all agree that it's wrong to cause suffering unless there's a good reason to do so. Premise two, industrial farming causes billions of animals to suffer without good reason. And I hope many people will agree with that, but you could defend it by pointing out the comparatively minor taste pleasures or nutritional benefits that come from eating meat and compare that against the fact that humans can eat a perfectly healthy plant-based diet, right? So, not a particularly good reason, certainly not one that would outweigh all this terrible suffering. So, conclusion one, industrial animal farming is wrong. And then conclusion two, therefore, you shouldn't buy factory farmed products. Now, maybe some of you will remember from your introductory logic class, uh, conclusion two does not follow from the premises or from premise one, right? We need to additional kind of argument to get from the idea that it's wrong to do factory farming to the idea that it's wrong to buy factory farming products. We need some sort of link that links something that links the consumer's behavior to the wrongness of the farming. So I call this a bridge principle, right? Some way of connecting those two things, right? And as we're going to see, the existing bridge principles are not going to capture some of the freegan eating practices. So, what are some of the bridge principles on offer? One popular one we can call the expected consequences argument. And the idea is that, roughly speaking, if a consumer goes to the store and buys meat, there's a small chance that when they do that, they'll cause a little number to go up in the grocery store's systems, which maybe will eventually cause a number to go up in some distributors' systems. And then somebody at a company, like somebody like Tyson, will see this like small change in the number and go, "Oh, we need to farm more animals. We need to slaughter more animals. We need to produce more of these products." And the result is consumers can expect that there's a small chance of causing lots and lots of harm to animals when they buy meat, and this would be a reason why it would be wrong to do so. Um, and I admit that I am basically moved by this argument. I think this is why it explains why it's often or usually wrong to buy meat. But it does leave a little bit of wiggle room because it depends on the fact that you're expecting this to have these particular consequences. So if you don't expect the consequences, if I don't expect that eating the chicken sandwich in my fridge that my friend left behind, I don't expect that that's going to lead to any um, animal suffering. It's not gonna lead to any rights violations, right? Um, so other possible bridge principles on offer try to close this gap a little bit, and they're going to appeal to something else. They're going to say, we're what's wrong about consumers buying these factory farm products? It's well, we're in some sense participating in the wrongdoing, or we're contributing to the wrongdoing, or we're supporting the wrongdoing. Um, so that's another route you can go. And one prominent proponent of this sort of strategy was Tom Regan. And I got to spend a lot of time reading through his oeuvre during my time at NC State. And I was really curious about what sorts of bridge principles he was appealing to when, like, he obviously thought we shouldn't eat meat, we shouldn't buy animal products. So Reagan famously does not like the expected consequences argument, in part because it leaves open the possibility that it's totally fine to buy meat or to eat it sometimes. That it's not guaranteed because, right, you just have to, it depends on the consequences. Um, and throughout his work, including his uh, unpublished drafts, his unpublished papers, his notes, um, he uses different kinds of terms and appeals to different ways that you might link the wrongness of the consumer practice to the wrongness of the farming practice. Um, so here are some of the ways that he talks about it. He talks about it as being causally implicated in an unjust practice. He talks about it in terms of helping the perpetrators. He talks about it in terms of supporting those who are doing the most wrong. And this is one that shows up a lot in his published work, the supporting that shows up a lot. He talks a lot about, or sorry, he talks about being party to the perpetuation of an unjust practice. He talks about contributing to wrongdoing, encouraging those who do wrong. And my interpretation of this is that each of these ideas, each of these ways of putting it, appeals to a notion of participation. So even if we aren't doing the wrong ourselves, we're not doing the killing, we're not doing the factory farming, we're not doing the mutilating, um, we're somehow tied up with those who are. We're somehow participating in the practice. So here are some of these examples from the archives. We've got some handwritten notes, we've got some early drafts, we've got some unpublished papers. It was really cool to go through the Tom Reagan papers here and learn about his ideas, how they developed over time, getting to see the kind of correspondences with others, like correspondences with journals, correspondences with other philosophers. It was really illuminating, and I found the experience super valuable. These are I just digitally highlighted on here on these documents some of the places where he uses these kinds of turns of phrase, the helping, the contributing, the being party to, the supporting, all of that stuff. Here is the issue with the existing bridge principles on offer, the ways of linking our behavior to the behavior of the industrial animal agriculture. So, like I said, if I'm gonna eat meat that's bound for the trash and that I didn't buy, that does not have an expected consequence of animal suffering or animal rights violations. Like, there's no expectation that if I eat that sandwich that my friend left behind, that more the animals' rights are going to be violated or that they're going to suffer because of it. Um, and similarly, the other kinds of participatory bridge principles don't seem to apply here. I'm not helping the perpetrators of animal abuse in any way, right? I'm not supporting them. I am not contributing. I'm not supporting them financially, right? I'm not lending like moral support or, public relations support. I'm not contributing financially or in any of these other ways. I'm certainly not encouraging them. And in fact, I'm like loudly telling them over and over again, stop, please stop. I'm actively discouraging people from abusing animals. Um, there's a little bit of a tricky case here with the idea of being party to the perpetuation of an unjust practice. Um, the answer is maybe. Um, I don't want to go into too much detail here because I think it'll take us too far afield. I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A if people are interested. But very quickly, there's like lots of unjust practices in the world, and I seem to be, in some sense, like involved with them a little bit. But often we have the intuition that I don't act wrongly in any way. So, for example, if I buy a computer that has parts of it that are conflict minerals, I'm definitely party to an unjust practice in some way. Um, Most people don't think it's wrong to buy computers because of this. Um, I might think that there are many injustices in our criminal justice system, but I think it's permissible to participate in that in various ways. So like to serve a jury duty or, if I'm the victim of assault, to call the police. I think these are ways that you could be party to some unjust practices, but I don't think we act wrongly when we do these things. So the problem with this kind of approach is it's not going to give us the verdict that it's wrong to do this. Even if we are party to an unjust practice, it might not be wrong. Happy to talk about that more if people are interested, but um, that's all I'll say there. So this is the state of the debate then, right? It looks like there are some good reasons to be new omnivores. The current principles on offer don't seem to show that it's wrong to engage in these new omnivorous practices. But I'm not satisfied. I have I have these kind of intuitions, right? That it still seems like it's wrong to eat meat and do these other things. So, what could be said in defense? And my goal is to show that there are moral reasons that count against new omnivorism, that outweigh whatever considerations are in its favor. Conclusion being that we shouldn't eat meat. I shouldn't eat the chicken sandwich in the fridge. We shouldn't be new omnivores, in short. To do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about moral character. So it's going to get a little abstract for a second, and then I'll bring it down to earth with some examples. So here's how I'm thinking about moral character. Uh, Emotional responses can be morally evaluable. What do I mean by that? So imagine that my sister is something excellent happens to her and she's very happy, and her happiness makes me happy. Now imagine a different situation, a different version where something terrible happens to her and she suffers. She suffers a lot. And her suffering makes me happy. So in both cases, I'm feeling happy. I'm happy either because she's happy or I'm happy because she's suffering. And one of those seems morally better than the other, right? It's better to be happy about her happiness, assuming everything else equal that, she's she's a decent person and all that stuff. Taking pleasure, being happy at her misery seems worse than being happy at her happiness. Um, so it seems like emotional responses can matter morally. That can be the kind of things that we can evaluate. Next piece, valenced perceptions can be morally evaluable. What does that mean? So our perceptions come from our five senses, right? We see the world, we smell it, we taste it, we touch it, we hear it, but we don't do so neutrally. They our perceptions come with sort of motivational weight and certain practical saliences. So, for example, I'm standing in the road and there's a car hurtling towards me. I'm not merely seeing a car-shaped object approaching, hearing the rush of wind and tires on the asphalt. No, no, no. I my my perception of this car is much richer than this. I have a there's a affective component. I'm fearful, and there's a motivational component. There's a uh, get out of the way, right? So I don't just see this collection of sounds and sights and stuff. I see something to avoid. That's what I see. Right? So that's a valenced perception. That's what I'm talking about. Um, and in the car example, it doesn't really seem like it might be relevant for ethics. But now instead of a car approaching me, imagine that it's a person approaching me. And imagine so that person they look foreign to me. And that makes me feel fear, and that makes me feel a desire to get away because I'm perceiving them to be foreign. Now, that all of a sudden looks like something that matters for ethics. That seems like something that we can evaluate. It seems like something might be going wrong there. Okay, so that's how emotional responses and valence perceptions can matter morally for ethics. And here's the thing about perceptions and emotions is we don't really have direct control over them. I can't just choose to be disappointed instead of excited. I can't choose to see the oncoming car as a collection of uh, gears and machine parts. I, I'm seeing it as something that I have to get out of the way of. And I can't just snap my fingers and choose otherwise. And this is because we have dispositions or tendencies that are ingrained in us to feel and perceive in certain ways, right? This is something that comes from habit, it comes from practice, it comes from enculturation, from being part of a social world. And these things we might have some indirect control over. We might be able to change our environment, we might be able to practice. I mean, it takes work, but these dispositions, these tendencies are things that maybe we can indirectly influence. All right. That was all very abstract. I'm going to bring it down to earth with an example. I apologize in advance to the man who posed for this stock photo because I'm about to make him out to be, he's going to play a mean character in this example. Sorry. He's going to play Jim. Jim is a white person living in a remote community populated only by other white people. Jim consumes a lot of right-wing content on TV and on the internet, and he develops a dislike for non-white people from afar. He sees people of different races on TV or in positions of authority, and that makes him upset. It makes him feel resentful. He has these negative affective and perceptual responses towards people who aren't white. Um, but he never leaves his town, so he never actually encounters a non-white person. And he also was taught growing up that you should be polite, and that means if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. So he never mentions this prejudice to anybody. He doesn't act on it, but he harbors it and he feels it very strongly. Now, I think it's pretty clear that these racist attitudes make Jim's character worse. Even if he's not going around harming anybody, right? He's not using slurs, he's not discriminating against people. He's not maybe we'll even say he's not voting in ways that are going to end up hurting people. Um, we could really drive this home by imagining he just feels racist emotions and has racist perceptions of fictional characters, right? Where he doesn't seem to be harming or wronging anybody, but something's wrong, right? And of course, we can evaluate those emotions that he feels and those perceptions that he has, and he might not have direct control over those in the moment, right? He can't just choose to feel differently or perceive differently, but he might have some indirect control, right? He has some control over the things that he reads and the things that he watches. He has some control over his environment. He has over the people he hangs out with, things like that. So he does have a little bit of indirect control, but he can't just snap his fingers and change. Now, oops. This is important because these dispositions to feel and to perceive in certain ways, they can conflict with our better judgment. So we can believe something, but still have our feelings and perceptions not line up with our beliefs. So imagine that Jim does a little bit of reading, he's exposed to new ideas, and he realizes, okay, actually racism is wrong, it's bad. Um, so he starts to become like an egalitarian. He thinks everybody's equal. He believes that, but he still has this lifetime of baggage of practice and enculturation and training, and it's very plausible that his perceptions and his feelings are still going to be disposed to have these prejudiced responses, right? He might still have these negative responses, even if he like technically believes something else, um, right? Because it can take a lot of work to undo these kinds of long patterns of enculturation. So, I mean, there are things he could do, right? He might notice a particular feeling or perception and try to disavow it. He might change his uh, the things he reads. He might change the things he watches. And if he's hanging out with a bunch of prejudiced people, he might try to change his environment a little bit. So there are there are things you could do to try to work on this stuff. So that's character. That's why it matters for ethics. Let's bring it back to animals. I'm sure many of you, if you're familiar with some of the animal ethics world, the animal protection world, you've heard a little bit about speciesism. So the idea is that species by itself is a morally arbitrary category. So species is a biological classification, right? It has to do with, how you're classified in this scheme of taxonomy. And that doesn't seem to matter for moral consideration, how you get classified in this biological groupings. It also doesn't seem to matter things like size or shape or color. Those don't seem to matter for whether or not you deserve moral consideration. It also doesn't seem to matter morally whether an animal seems cute to humans, right? These are all morally arbitrary. Your moral consideration shouldn't depend on any of these things. And so there's a parallel with kinds of human prejudices, right? So we might think that certain kinds of phenotypes associated with races or ethnicities, so hair color, skin color, facial features, or certain kinds of genetic, like maybe sex chromosomes. These don't seem like the kinds of things that should affect your moral consideration. Um, no, they might line up with things that tend to matter morally, right? So if you have particular sex, uh, you have features, maybe that's correlated with being discriminated against. That might matter for ethics, right? Um, Species tends to be correlated with things that might matter for ethics, things like having certain capacities or having certain kinds of interests. But there are always going to be individual deviations from species norms, right? And treating individuals differently, giving them different moral consideration merely on these arbitrary lines, these arbitrary features, that's an instance of prejudice. Like in the same way that these arbitrary features can be instances of prejudice between humans. And to use a very tired example, right? We've been habituated to treat animals differently based on these kind of arbitrary features, right? We think of dogs as social and intelligent and friendly, so they get to sleep on the couch. And then, you know, people think of pigs as being, dirty, they belong on farms and in slaughterhouses. Never mind, of course, that, pigs are just as friendly and social and intelligent as dogs, if not more so, right? So animal protectionists reject speciesism, um, right? But they can still be enculturated to have speciesist perceptions and emotions, right? So, for example, we might conceptualize some animals as gross or seeming like a pest, even if they don't pose us any threat. So maybe like slugs. Maybe they seem gross because of socialization, but they're not going to harm you. So that can, even animal protectionists can be fall prey to this stuff. So how does this relate to meat and meat eating? Well, a willingness to eat only some kinds of animal flesh is good evidence of speciesist prejudice, right? The differences between dogs and cats and pigs are there's a lot of them that are morally arbitrary, right? But we have very strong asymmetrical attitudes. We feel very differently about their flesh, right? Um, it would be horrifying. People are horrified to learn that a piece of meat came from a dog or from a cat or from a human, right? And many people are willing to eat some kinds of flesh, but not others, right? They're willing to eat non-human flesh, but not willing to eat human flesh. They're willing to eat some animals, but not others, right? Um, and this is all rooted in speciesist prejudice, and animal protectionists, again, aren't immune, right? We spent our whole lives coming up in this world where it's normal to see cow and pig and chicken flesh in the grocery store and not bat an eye at it, but being terrified or um, disturbed by other kinds of flesh, right? We're all habituated this way. But we know that this is morally arbitrary, and we know that prejudice is the kind of thing that makes our character worse, right? So if we're seeing for arbitrary reasons these kinds of flesh is in these totally different lights, um, in a way that's prejudiced, we have moral reasons to change those dispositions, to see some flesh in one way and other kinds of flesh in this totally different way, right? Um, we want our best judgment and our perceptions and emotional responses, we want them to line up, right? So we don't want to have this big gap. Like we in principle understand that there's no, there's nothing really that different morally speaking about pigs versus dogs, but we have these asymmetrical responses and we want them to be lined up in a way that's not prejudice. So how do we correct for this prejudice? Uh, Many of us are already averse to some kinds of flesh, right? Whether it's the result of violence or disease or natural disaster or seeing like a horror film, like a slasher, people have strong negative emotions to human gore, to human corpses, right? This is widespread. So we already have some sort of negative responses, right? Or we have certain kinds of emotional responses, but we also perceive it in certain ways. We don't see the human gore. We don't see it as like food is the kind of thing that you would eat. Um, and we already have some emotional and perceptual responses to non-human animal flesh, like roadkill. So we feel some sadness, we feel some, repulsion. Maybe we want to look away. It's upsetting. And in both of these cases, we think it's appropriate to do so, right? We don't look at the human corpse and say, yum yum, that would make a delicious meal, right? And we also don't look at the roadkill and say, and think something like that. In fact, it seems appropriate, right? That we might feel a little sad or disturbed because an animal being struck by a vehicle is a sad, often gruesome affair, right? So it seems like these negative responses are appropriate. And it also seems like it would be inappropriate to respond in an opposite kind of way. So if someone saw some roadkill and got really like excited and or like they thought the colors were really pretty, they looked at all the red and they were like, "Wow, how delightful." We would think, "Whoa, something's inappropriate about that response." So we already have some kinds of aversive responses to flesh in some cases. And what I want to suggest is if we want our responses to be similar along kinds of flesh in ways that aren't prejudiced, I'm suggesting we should cultivate the kind of aversion that we already have towards human and some kinds of non-human flesh, towards the flesh of animals that are raised for food. So the pigs, the cows, the chickens. We want to find ways to see and respond to that kind of flesh more similarly to the ways that we respond to human flesh and roadkill. So that's going to involve trying to cultivate an aversion to the kinds of meat that are typically thought of as food, right? So I think a not prejudiced, anti-speciesist response, somebody would who's ideally anti-speciesist and doesn't have prejudice be part of their character, wouldn't respond to meat. They wouldn't see a rotisserie chicken and think it smells delicious or, have their mouth water. They wouldn't think of it as the kind of thing, you know, a lot of people say, all right, I'm not going to eat that. I'm not going to buy that. It would be wrong. I don't want to participate. I don't want to support. I don't want to be a part of animal agriculture. But I mean, it would be delicious to eat it. So some people are in that kind of space. And I want to say, ideally, we want to move away from that space. So it's not the kind of thing that's tempting and tantalizing and we have to resist it on principle, but it's something that we feel similarly saddened by or just or a little bit repulsed by in the way that we feel around like corpses or human gore or roadkill. And here's how I think we respond to the new omnivores to the freegan eating cases. Because if you're open to eating these freegan meats, right, you're not cultivating these more symmetrical attitudes. Because if you're doing this, you're only going to be eating uh, the the animals that we typically think of as the animals that are food for arbitrary reasons. It's you're gonna be eating freaking chicken, cow, pig flesh. Freegans aren't gonna be eating human corpses. They're not gonna be eating, dog and cat corpses, right? Um, so this prejudice is not gonna be it's gonna be either sustained or further ingrained, right? So, and this prejudice, I think, makes our characters worse. I take it that animal protectionists should agree with this since they reject speciesism and a willingness to be a new omnivore, to be a freegan, towards only some kinds of creatures and not others for morally arbitrary reasons is going to be contributing to that prejudice. And we want to be unlearning it. We want to be undoing it. We want to be practicing, we want to be habituating ourselves to see it differently, right? And that takes time and effort. So if we find ourselves attracted to a meat dish, what we might do is we might notice that thought, try to disavow it. Maybe we could imagine the animal it used to be a part of. Um, right? You could try changing things about your environment, things like this, so you're not constantly surrounded by it. There's lots of things you might try to do to slowly change your perceptual and affective responsive dispositions. Okay. So in conclusion, it's morally better to be the kind of person who sees animals as fellow creatures, not mere resources. This is something that I think animal protectionists all agree with. And what does this look like? It looks like trying to bring our judgments about, like our true beliefs about animals and the morally arbitrary nature of species prejudice and align the way that we feel and the way that we see and the way that we perceive. We want those to be lined up. And to do this, we're going to probably have to work to cultivate an aversion to uh, meat that people typically think of as edible, right? That's going to take time, energy, and practice. Um, and I think this gives us good reasons to avoid freegan meat, and it's going to outweigh whatever the minor reasons we have to eat freegan, according to the new omnivores. Thank you so much. Here are some of the references for the ideas in this talk. And that's all I've got. And there's my animal companion there. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? I'll give a very, very long pause. Zach, while we're waiting, I'd be curious to hear from your perspective what you learned from researching in an archive specifically, sort of from beginning to end, since you came from a field in which you maybe hadn't had as much background
Mhm.
in that work. And I'd be really curious as to what your process was and how that informed what you really learned in the process.
Yeah. Well, I learned a lot about how historical archives work, and that was new to me. That was super exciting. I found it really valuable, especially thinking about like Tom Reagan's work. As I think of him as kind of interlocutor, he's still a major part of the talk today, the way people talk about these issues today. And seeing his like correspondences with journals and other philosophers, seeing the reception of his work. I saw some like things that you usually never see the light of day. So I saw some like early reviews from peer review of the case for animal rights, and some of them were quite negative, and I thought that was super fascinating. And of course, that was before it became the huge influential book that it was. It just shows like where philosophers' heads were at the time and um, how different what he was doing was, and how much he shifted the conversation with that work. I mean, I think that some of the negative peer review stuff was like maybe not warranted. But it was really interesting to see how um, before, like people were thinking about it before it was the kind of foundational text that it was, things like that. Um, I mean, so that's all relevant for this stuff. I got to dig around in all sorts of other interesting things that weren't related to Tom Reagan, like the Wimdecock papers, or the collection, and the Bernard Unti stuff. So it was super fascinating to see how different kinds of groups in different times and places have advocated for animal protection. Um, a lot of it is, I think, kind of different in the way the philosophers approach it, which was also very helpful to see and to recognize that maybe thinking about how advocacy on one side might be quite different project than the kind of figuring out the nitty-gritty of the philosophical details. So that was really illuminating, I think, especially in like other kind of time periods and cultures. Got to see stuff from um, way way back, think like early mid 1800s, and then also like lots of different countries, and it looks different in each of them.
Great. I actually have two questions now in the queue, if you'll allow me. I think this question here, I think it's not controversial to say that many people see vegans as moralistic and punitive.
Mhm.
So some vegan folks are emphasizing pleasure instead of aversion. Do you see a possibility of a less aversive argument that fits your theoretical model?
Good. I think that's a great question. So I guess I'm interested in the way that like we ought to be, and that might be slightly different from what's like the best strategy to bring people on board. So maybe we shouldn't tell everybody that they should be grossed out by meat, at least not in the early stages of trying to convince people, because I do think it's both more effective and very helpful to think about pleasure and getting super excited about plant-based foods. And that was actually a huge part of what made like becoming vegan was super exciting for me, was learning about the joy of cooking all these new kinds of cuisines and discovering all these new ingredients that I hadn't worked with before. So it really was a fun and exciting process, and I didn't have the sense that it was super burdensome. And I agree that we should be emphasizing that side of it too. Um, so we should be getting people excited about all these like plant-based foods and ingredients. And that might even be a more effective way of bringing people on board. Um, So I also think that like some of the other arguments are maybe more effective in terms of like I think that the consequences argument, the expected consequences, the participation, that captures, a lot, but certainly not all cases. And I think those are also the ones we should probably start with. I think this is more for people who are already sympathetic to animal protection, but are curious about exactly what that means for their lives.
I have a few more questions that are coming up, which is great. Somebody shares, thank you for the talk. One question I have is that many who are interested in logical arguments like this would claim that if they were in dire circumstances, they would eat a dog or a human corpse as long as they did not actively kill, which also proves in their mind that they are not speciesist. How would you respond?
Good. So I think in doing it in dire circumstances is, I think, a little bit different than doing it in non-dire circumstances. So I do think, I mean, I'll go on record and say that like if I felt like I had to survive in like one of these horrible cases where people are in like a plane crash, I probably would eat human flesh. I don't think there's anything, I actually don't think it's necessarily like disrespectful or wrong if all the other circumstances are in place such that you're not, killing and you're not doing all these horrible, cruel things. Um, I would feel very bad about it. And I think that might be the appropriate way to do it. Like, you shouldn't be really excited that you were part of this plane crash scenario and oh boy, I get to try human flesh. Like, finally, it's morally okay. I'm in a situation where it's morally okay for me to do that. That would be, um, so I think that sort of attitude that we would do it reluctantly. We would do it grudgingly. That's the kind of attitude that I think we should have in these kind of like disaster scenarios. Um, so I think the fact that somebody would grudgingly eat uh, human or dog corpses, I don't think is enough to establish the that it's not speciesist if they would take pleasure in eating like cow or pig or chicken flesh. I think that's it's still asymmetrical in a way that could be prejudice.
Okay, I have three more questions. Our next one is, are there other areas of current philosophical discussion outside of animal protection and these particular arguments that you've seen for how this kind or moral reasoning is used? I'm wondering about environmental and other areas of concern where similar might be applied.
Good. Yeah. Um, I'm not deep in the literature of some of these other ones, but the answer is yes, absolutely. People apply this kind of approach to other sorts of um, ethical issues. I have a slightly idiosyncratic way of talking about character. It's not that different from other people who talk about moral character, but um, I like talking about it in the way I do. I feel like it lets me be precise in a certain kind of way. But I do think there's some really excellent work. So for example, there's a guy, Dale Jamieson, has a paper called like why um, something like when utilitarians should be virtue ethicists or green virtues. It's people who think we should be trying to cultivate certain kinds of attitudes and dispositions towards environmental issues. And I think that works excellent. And I agree, yeah, that makes sense and that we want to be doing that in other areas. And maybe, so here's an example. Things that are like the sorts of practices that we might want to encourage, we don't want them to seem super burdensome. So for example, like finding ways to, so that if you're like, oh, it'd be good to be composting, instead of thinking, oh, that's another chore I have to do. No, finding ways to reframe and think about it differently, getting excited about it, and the ways that you can, like, it can be like fruitful for gardening. Right? So thinking about the perceptions and the affective responses, I think is very useful for all areas of ethics.
Okay, great. Another question, are you concerned about a certain privileging of an assumed we who have access to a wide-ranging plant-based diet? In that case, moral behavior may depend on accessing freegan food.
Good. Yeah. Um, so I take these reasons to not 100% always be decisive. I think they're pretty good reasons. Like in the case of like survival, right? I think there are cases where um like in the plane crash case, right? I don't think moral character is the only thing that matters. Um, and it's also like this long-term pattern of, practice and habit building. So, um, I think I guess there's a couple strands to this question that I'm trying to pick apart because there's maybe a kind of question of like access to plant-based foods is one thing, and then and so I guess maybe we could focus on that, which is um the considerations of developing non-prejudiced character are one among several. So um including the like expected consequences and stuff like that. So if you are in a position where you really need to get certain kinds of nutrition and you don't want to contribute by like buying or purchasing, or maybe you can't afford to buy or purchase, then I think it might be okay to say, look, uh, my own survival, my own being able to get adequate nutrition right now is slightly higher priority than focusing on this project of not being speciesist. And maybe there are ways to go about it intentionally. So yeah, it's one among several kinds of moral projects, and you know, your own uh, not being malnourished is something that also you got to take care of. So.
So I think my last question, about 2 minutes left, is do you have thoughts on encouraging children to think from this moral perspective when it puts them at odds with their parents? And that's our last one.
Ooh, interesting. Um, yeah, I've got a lot of. I'll just say I have some conflicting views about this because I do believe it's important to um, teach people about issues in animal ethics. I also think that there are people who make moral mistakes or people that have mistaken views, and I don't always think that it's my place to. Uh, I think we need to give people latitude to like parent the way that they want. Now, so those are kind of like conflicting, things pulling in different directions. I don't think that means I can't say something about like, oh, like that's how unpleasant for the chicken. I think that's perfectly fine to say. I think it's fine to like give kids plant-based foods. I don't think it would be, it might be, it probably also depends on the age a lot. There's a certain like point where people start to be able to think for themselves and develop their own perspective on things. Probably pretty different for like a 5 or 6 year old versus like a 12 or 13-year old. So I don't have a very satisfying answer. I do encourage people who are sympathetic to get their kids to also be sympathetic. So yeah, I don't have a conclusive, yeah.
Okay, well, I think unfortunately we're out of time, and there may be some extra comments about that as well, but this will be put online later so all can access. So I just wanted to wrap up, and again, thank you, Zach, for joining us today with your talk, and thank you everybody here who joined us. So we will have this online soon, and just final thank yous to everybody. Thanks for joining.